On June 30, 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo celebrated what should have been a triumphant moment, independence from brutal Belgian colonial rule. The nation rejoiced as the Belgian flag was lowered, and the Congolese flag rose to the sound of drums and ululations. But beneath the celebration lurked chaos. Belgium had ruled Congo with iron fists and rubber whips for 75 years, extracting wealth while denying its people education and governance experience. When they left, they handed over a broken system with no plan for stability, just a ticking time bomb wrapped in a flag. In a stunning display of colonial arrogance, only 17 Congolese had university degrees at the time of independence. The civil service, army, and infrastructure were all still dominated by Belgian officials, who remained in the country, expecting to still pull the strings. Days after independence, the Congolese army mutinied against their Belgian officers. Violence erupted in the streets. Belgian citizens fled. The newly appointed President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba had no blueprint to contain the fire. Congo was rich in resources but poor in unity. The mineral-rich province of Katanga, backed by Belgian business interests, declared secession just 11 days after independence under Moise Tshombe. The new Congolese state was being torn apart by internal divisions and foreign manipulation. Belgian troops returned, claiming to protect their citizens, but their real mission was clear: control Katanga's copper and uranium mines. Lumumba, the young and defiant nationalist, warned the world, "Our enemies are still here, hiding behind handshakes." Desperate and surrounded, Lumumba made a move that would mark him forever in Cold War history. He reached out to the Soviet Union for help. To Western powers, this was unacceptable. Africa was not allowed to choose its own path. Congo, with its strategic minerals and location, became a geopolitical chessboard between the US and USSR. A newly independent nation had become the pawn of empires. Lumumba was now a target. What followed wasn't just a civil war, it was the orchestrated destruction of Congo's future. In its first week of freedom, the country began to collapse, not because of its people, but because of a world that refused to let it be truly free. The independence parade had barely ended when the vultures descended. Patrice Emery Lumumba wasn't supposed to lead. A former beer salesman with a thunderous voice and burning ideals, he emerged as the face of Congolese resistance, bold, black, and unbowed. In a world still shackled by imperial power, Lumumba dared to look Europe in the eye and say, "No more." His Independence Day speech shocked the Belgian king and Western diplomats. Unlike his peers who offered polite gratitude, Lumumba unleashed decades of buried rage. "We are no longer your monkeys." For millions of Africans, it was the first time someone had said it so clearly. For the West, it was a declaration of war. Lumumba's vision was dangerous, not because it was violent, but because it was powerful. He wanted a united Congo. A Congo that controlled its own wealth. A Congo free from the long claws of colonial corporations. To do that, he needed to suppress the Katanga rebellion and reclaim national unity. But the moment he asked the Soviets for military support, after the West ignored his pleas, he signed his death warrant. The CIA branded him a threat to Western interests. In Washington, London, and Brussels, the mission was clear: remove Lumumba, by any means necessary. Within months, Lumumba was betrayed. Arrested by his own army, flown to the breakaway Katanga region, and handed over to his enemies. What followed was a horror cloaked in silence. On January 17, 1961, he was beaten, tortured, and executed by a firing squad, his body dismembered and dissolved in acid under the supervision of Belgian officers. His wife Pauline wasn't informed. His children never saw his grave. His body was erased, but his spirit was not. Decades later, a Belgian officer confessed, "We were terrified of what Lumumba represented. So we made him disappear." The West called it stability. But what they really created was a power vacuum, a land bleeding without a leader. In a shocking twist, the United Nations, which had thousands of troops stationed in Congo, refused to intervene in Lumumba's illegal detention and murder. Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld himself would die mysteriously just months later, in a suspicious plane crash while trying to negotiate peace in Congo. The world watched Lumumba die, and said nothing. Not a whisper. Not a protest. Today, Lumumba is a martyr, a symbol of Africa's interrupted revolution. His final letter, written in chains, still haunts the continent. The day will come when history will speak. Africa will write its own history, and it will be a history of glory and dignity. But before that day could come, the shadows took over. And in the darkness, rose a man who would rule with iron and silence for over 3 decades. In the ashes of Lumumba's murder, a new figure emerged from the shadows, Joseph Desire Mobutu. Once Lumumba's trusted army chief, Mobutu had turned against him, lured by briefcases of cash, whispered promises, and a thirst for power. Backed by the CIA and Belgian intelligence, Mobutu staged a quiet coup cloaked in the language of order. He wasn't the people's choice, but he had the guns, the foreign backing, and the cold cunning of a man who knew how to survive. He wore sunglasses even at night, hiding eyes that betrayed no emotion, only calculation. Mobutu was the perfect Cold War puppet, African in face, Western in loyalty. With Lumumba gone, the Americans moved quickly. CIA planes dropped supplies. Swiss bank accounts swelled. Mobutu was declared savior of the Congo, but in truth, he became the gatekeeper for foreign exploitation. He renamed the country Zaire, but the mask of nationalism couldn't hide the rot. Mobutu's first act: ban political opposition. His second: reward himself with a lavish palace deep in the jungle, complete with golden toilets while millions starved in mud huts. Under Mobutu, corruption wasn't a side effect, it was the system. Ministers were encouraged to steal, so long as they stayed loyal. He looted billions, while schools decayed, hospitals crumbled, and roads vanished into dust. The West turned a blind eye. Why? Because Mobutu was their man. As long as he kept the Soviets out, he could drain the nation dry. Washington and Paris clinked champagne glasses while children died of curable diseases in Kinshasa's slums. Congo, once full of promise, had become a tragicomic stage where the puppeteers danced and the people bled. But Mobutu wasn't just a puppet, he evolved into a strongman. He crushed dissent with iron fists, feeding journalists to crocodiles and exiling intellectuals. His enemies vanished. His image was plastered on money, churches, and even prayer books. He declared himself the father of the nation, but he ruled like a feudal king, cloaked in leopard skin hats and delusions of grandeur. Zaire was rich in diamonds, cobalt, and uranium, but poor in hope. The blood of Lumumba had barely dried before his dream was buried under marble statues of Mobutu. Behind every dictator is a trail of silence. Mobutu survived coup attempts, economic collapse, and even ridicule. But the people never forgot. In whispers, songs, and proverbs, they remembered a time before betrayal. A time when they believed. And while the world hailed Mobutu as a stabilizing force, the soul of Congo continued to rot, drained not just by its ruler, but by the empires that applauded him. This wasn't stability. It was strategic decay. And the next chapter would be even bloodier. Katanga. To the world, it was just another African province. But to the elite, Belgian mining companies, European financiers, and Cold War operatives, it was the golden heart of Congo. Rich in copper, uranium, and cobalt, Katanga wasn't just valuable, it was strategic. When Congo gained independence, Katanga's secession in July 1960 wasn't spontaneous, it was engineered. Moise Tshombe, the puppet leader of Katanga, declared it a breakaway state, fully backed by Belgian military advisors and business interests. Congo had barely been born, and already, it was being carved apart. Foreign corporations didn't want Congo united. They wanted Katanga isolated, where they could control the mines without taxes or a nationalist government demanding accountability. Belgian paratroopers returned, pretending to protect lives, but their real mission was to secure access to uranium, the same kind used in the Hiroshima bomb, mined right there in Katanga. It wasn't just secession. It was economic sabotage disguised as self-determination. While Congolese children starved in Leopoldville, diamonds and copper flowed freely out of Katanga into European vaults. Tshombe ruled Katanga like a CEO in military fatigues. Backed by white mercenaries, including ex-Nazis and South African apartheid soldiers, he built a brutal regime that hunted down Lumumba loyalists. Villages were razed, political opponents were disappeared, and the bodies piled up far from the cameras. This was no longer Congo's war, it was a corporate coup masquerading as a rebellion. Every bullet fired in Katanga had a Western fingerprint. Every rebel uniform stitched in Europe. Every silence from the UN, deliberate. When the United Nations finally acted, it was too little, too late. The UN launched Operation Morthor in 1961 to forcibly end the secession, but chaos erupted. UN soldiers, bound by weak mandates, clashed with Tshombe's mercenaries. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The fighting was brutal, the strategy confused, the outcome uncertain. And then, as if cursed, UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld died in a mysterious plane crash en route to peace talks with Tshombe. Many still believe his plane was deliberately shot down to stop any real solution. Katanga's rebellion ended in 1963, but the damage was done. The dream of a unified Congo had been mutilated in its infancy. Katanga wasn't just a region, it was the proof that Congo's real war wasn't tribal or ethnic, it was economic, and it was global. The invisible war over minerals had claimed its first victim, national sovereignty. And in the silence that followed, the Congo descended deeper into the abyss, its wounds festering, its soul fractured. When the Congo Crisis spiraled beyond control, the world turned to the United Nations, but what arrived wasn't salvation. It was a gamble. The UN operation in the Congo, ONUC, became one of the largest and most controversial peacekeeping missions in history. Thousands of troops from India, Ghana, Sweden, and beyond parachuted into the heart of a war they didn't understand, bound by a weak mandate and political red tape. They were told to maintain order without choosing sides, but in a war where every side was bloody, neutrality became complicity. The UN arrived with blue helmets, but no clear mission. While villages burned and civilians fled, they were ordered not to fire unless fired upon. They watched Lumumba get arrested. They stood by as Katanga grew stronger. And when the world demanded action, the UN launched Operation Morthor, a chaotic offensive in Katanga that failed to bring peace, but succeeded in escalating the violence. UN bases were bombed. Civilians were massacred. Entire towns were caught in the crossfire. What began as a peacekeeping force became an accidental participant in civil war. In the shadows of UN paralysis, mercenaries flooded in. Ex-French foreign legionnaires, apartheid South African commandos, British adventurers, and even ex-Nazis found new purpose in Congo's killing fields. They were paid in diamonds and blood, hired by Tshombe and other warlords to train militias, crush uprisings, and assassinate political opponents. With no laws, No borders, and no morality, they carved up Congo like hired butchers. They brought helicopters, machine guns, and torture chambers. Where the UN hesitated, the mercenaries executed. Where the world debated, they decimated. The Congo became a testing ground for covert warfare, with spies, agents, and rogue generals operating in plain sight. The CIA ran secret arms drops. MI6 passed intelligence to Katongan rebels. Soviet agents played their part, whispering in Lumumba's former allies' ears. Congo wasn't just bleeding, it was being dismembered by invisible hands pulling strings from thousands of miles away. And the people? They were collateral, bodies buried in mass graves, mothers searching for vanished sons, orphans hiding in jungles with memories too heavy to carry. In the end, the UN claimed it helped hold Congo together. But at what cost? Thousands dead. Trust shattered. A nation traumatized. The operation exposed a haunting truth: even peacekeeping, in Africa, can be weaponized. And when international actors fail, it's the civilians who pay the ultimate price. As the mercenaries flew out and cameras turned away, the war morphed into something far worse, a silence so deep, it buried the dead before they could be mourned. They were buried without names. No tombstones. No headlines. Just shallow graves under the Congolese sun. The world remembers the Cold War's victories and losses, the chess moves of empires, but it forgets the pawns left bleeding on the board. In Congo, tens of thousands died during the crisis, many burned alive in villages raided by mercenaries, or gunned down for refusing to kneel to whichever faction had seized their town that week. Children were bayoneted. Women were raped in front of their families. Entire communities vanished overnight. And the world called it internal unrest. There were no tribunals, no reparations. No museums for the dead. Congo's pain was buried beneath reports labeled classified and diplomatic cables stamped sensitive. The UN tallied body counts in cold digits. Western newspapers focused on Moscow and Washington, rarely printing the names of African victims unless a white mercenary had died. Meanwhile, Congolese mothers wandered from village to village with only a tattered photo and a question: "Have you seen my son?" But no one was listening. Their grief didn't fit the Cold War narrative. In the city of Stanleyville, UN troops and mercenaries allegedly stood by as hundreds were massacred during rebel crackdowns. Survivors described rivers choked with corpses and vultures circling for days. But few journalists arrived, and those who did were warned to keep their stories strategically balanced. In Kisangani, Lumumba supporters were hunted like animals. Pregnant women were mutilated. Priests disappeared. No one counted the bodies. Because the Congo crisis wasn't just a political war, it was an erasure of humanity. Worse still, the trauma became generational. Children born in refugee camps grew up to become child soldiers in later wars. Victims of rape gave birth to children who carried the scars of a war they never chose. Congo's soul didn't heal, it calcified into silence. A silence enforced by dictators, ignored by foreign powers, and internalized by a people who had to keep surviving, one breath at a time. The Congo crisis wasn't forgotten because it was unimportant. It was forgotten because remembering it would reveal too much, about greed, complicity, and global hypocrisy. And so, while the world teaches of Vietnam, Korea, and Cuba, Congo's war remains locked in the shadows, its ghost still roaming the forests, its truth buried beneath layers of diplomacy, denial, and dirt. But ghosts don't stay silent forever. And as the next war brews on the horizon, they return, not for vengeance, but for recognition. For justice. For remembrance. Because to forget them is to say they never mattered. And they did. They still do. The Congo Crisis ended on paper in 1965. But its flames never died, they simply moved underground, smoldering beneath the surface of African geopolitics, waiting for the next oxygen of betrayal to ignite them. What began as a fight for independence became a curse passed from one generation to the next. Congo would suffer 2 more wars, millions more deaths, and the systematic looting of its minerals, all rooted in the wounds first torn open in 1960. To this day, Congolese soil remains one of the richest on earth, yet its people remain among the poorest. That is not coincidence. It is consequence. Mobutu would rule for 32 years, propped up by the same Western powers that helped silence Lumumba. He became a symbol of everything Lumumba warned against: corruption, dependency, and elite betrayal. And when Mobutu finally fell in 1997, Congo didn't rise, it fractured. Foreign militias, multinational corporations, and neighboring states rushed in like vultures. Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, all took their piece. Congo's war became the deadliest conflict since World War II, with over 5 million dead, yet the world barely blinked. It wasn't just forgotten history, it was repeated tragedy. Look at your smartphone. The cobalt inside likely came from Congolese mines, some dug by children, under armed guard, in the same regions once torn apart by Chombe and the mercenaries. The players have changed, but the game hasn't. It's still about extraction. Still about silence. The Congo Crisis never really ended, it evolved. And the silence that allowed Lumumba to be murdered, that allowed UN troops to stand idle, is the same silence that allows exploitation today. Congo's war is not a relic of the past, it is a mirror of the present. And yet, through all the ashes, the spirit of Lumumba survives. In young pan-africanists who quote his speeches. In artists who paint his face on war-torn walls. In activists who fight for justice in a world built on denial. His prophecy came true. Africa will write its own history. And that history is no longer being whispered in exile, it's being shouted on stages, sung in songs, and filmed in documentaries like this one. The ghosts of the Congo Crisis are speaking. Not for revenge, but for truth. Because history, if buried, becomes poison. But when unearthed, it becomes power. Power to demand justice. Power to say never again. Power to honor those who were silenced. Africa's forgotten war is only forgotten if we allow it to be. And now, you know the truth. What will you do with it? Beneath Congo's soil lies unimaginable wealth, cobalt, coltan, gold, and diamonds, natural resources so valuable that they power the very devices we hold in our hands every day. That smartphone in your pocket likely contains cobalt mined from the Congo, often by exploited hands, sometimes even by children, in tunnels soaked with sweat and fear. The world's thirst for technology has come at the cost of Congolese blood. Yet this cycle of silent exploitation can be broken, not just by governments or corporations, but by you. By raising your voice, supporting ethical supply chains, and refusing to look away. The Congo Crisis may have ended decades ago, but the plunder continues. The people of Congo deserve more than pity, they deserve justice, dignity, and sovereignty over their own riches. If this story moved you, don't let it disappear into silence. Like this video. Share it with someone who thinks they know African history. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe to this channel for more hidden, untold, and powerful stories from the heart of Africa.